Hi guys, my name's Ryan, and I'm going to be speaking to you today. So as most of us already know, the American troops have been stationed in the Middle East for quite some time now. And the President declared that we are over there to establish a more peaceful and democratic society, and that we're trying to help the people in Iraq, Iran, and Afghanistan take a step toward tolerance and not violence. Now, in the spirit of this, earlier this year, Iran had its presidential election between incumbent Mahmoud Ahmadinejad and reformist Mir Hussein Mousavi. Now, Ahmadinejad won the election by a landslide, but there were many unclear and seemingly corrupt acts during the election, which made the results really questionable. This leads me to my main claim, that the Iranian presidential election was fixed. It's obvious that the incumbent Ahmadinejad fixed the election because of these three things. He won despite his falling popularity. He had fake ballots put in for himself in many of the voting stations, and he suppressed the people in many of the states from voting. My first point is that Ahmadinejad won despite of his falling popularity. The incumbent won the election with approximately 62% of the votes in Iran, although his popularity was extremely low, according to the Congressional Researching Service, or the CRS. Immediately after the election, the opponent candidate, Mousavi, demanded a recount, but he was denied. This was followed by major riots throughout most of the major cities in Iran, where the protesters claimed to have all voted for Mousavi, again according to the CRS. Now, how could this happen? If all the protesters voted for Mousavi, then how could he have lost? Now, one thing to consider is that during the election, Ahmadinejad was still president, and he still had control over the government, the voting workers, and the guards during the election. This brings me to my second point, that incumbent Ahmadinejad had fake ballots put in the voting stations throughout the country. On June 22nd, there were reports from the Iranian government Department of Financial and Political Records that there were at least 50 voting stations where there were more votes cast in the area than they were even voters. Coincidentally, all 50 of these voting stations were located in states where Ahmadinejad won. The government declared these as irregularities and would not act any further on the matter. According to the CRS and the national press coverage of the Iranian election, about after 2 months into Ahmadinejad's term, the Guardian Council, which is the judicial system in the Iranian government, acknowledged these irregularities, and the Supreme Leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, declared that former candidate Mousavi look into the matter. However, right after this, the President declared Mousavi a traitor to Iran, and that he be arrested on site and immediately taken in for questioning. My third point is that Ahmadinejad suppressed many of the people in Iran from voting. Now, according to CNN, who did a live video of some of the voting stations, many of the voting stations had armed guards who intimidated many of the people who were voting, and also when they came, the guards would tell them to go home or vote for the incumbent. Now, in some of the voting stations, nobody came at all. Now, CNN did an interview with one of the voting station workers who was working at one of the voting stations where nobody showed up. And the voting station worker said, although the voting station was open all day, nobody came. However, at the end of the day, the voting boxes were full of votes. How is that possible? That's insane. This seemed to be a recurring fact with other voting stations as well, where no voters even showed up. One interesting fact is that Mousavi lost to Ahmadinejad in Mousavi's own hometown, where the people had shown great support for Mousavi from the beginning of the election and throughout his campaign. Now, following the election, Mousavi's and his supporters gathered in Tehran to protest the election. There, Mousavi demanded a fresh election due to the fact that the recount would be corrupt and be done by the government that was already owned by Ahmadinejad. And the president then shut down all the journalist networks in Tehran and banned all foreign networks from broadcasting, forcing them to stay inside of their hotel rooms and not get any coverage of any of the protests that were going on outside that were led by the other candidate. Now, this shows that Ahmadinejad clearly did something weird or corrupt during the election, and now he doesn't want any of it to leak out to any of to the rest of the world, or to any of Iran. Now, Ahmadinejad won despite falling in popularity by suppressing Iranian voters and putting in fake ballots. I hope you are now as convinced as I am that the 2009 Iranian presidential election was fixed.
All right, well, the proposition's clear. The layout of the structure is fine. Signposting is pretty solid. I thought that you had some good information that you're presenting. Sometimes it's a little conclusionary, like the CRS analysis of his popularity is not really explained. There aren't any percentages. We don't know if it's a poll. It sounds pretty conclusionary. Later on, though, I thought you did a nice job with the example of the vote boxes that were full despite the fact that nobody voted in those areas, and then you combine that with the example of the opposition candidate's lack of support in his own hometown. I thought that that's an interesting illustration that suggests your conclusion is valid. I just, it's hard to find evidence when the evidence appears to have been suppressed, but I understand the position that you're taking. It's also probably easy to believe, given the subsequent actions of Ahmadinejad about the election, that something iffy is going on. I thought you had a nice summary at the end of the speech as well. All right. All right, Catherine, go quickly.